The Dark Prince at its time was one of the most revolutionary cards in Clash Royale. It brought some mechanics to the game that we hadn't seen in any other card. However, like many early cards, its uniqueness diminished over the years as more cards with new and similar mechanics were added. It hasn't always been easy to keep this card relevant, but they've certainly tried some interesting things over the years to ensure so. It's made many contributions to the meta throughout the years, and at certain points, completely disrupted it. So today, we're going to be covering the entire history of the Dark Prince, what made it so unique originally, all of the balance changes it's received, and see how it's doing today. This card was released on February 29, 2016, in the first batch of new cards released since the game's beta launch. It was a 4-elixir epic, and although I said it brought some interesting mechanics to the game and was very unique, it bore a striking resemblance to an already existing card, the Prince. The gimmick here was that after traveling 2.5 tiles, they would begin to charge. While in charge mode, they would move at more than twice their normal speed, faster than any other troop could move in the game, and deal double their normal damage output upon collision. Plus, their first hit attack time became instant rather than being half a second. Basically, they became a lot more dangerous. So what exactly separated the Dark Prince? Why did we need an alternative? Well, he was 1 less elixir, dealt a lot less damage, had a lot less health, and a shorter range. He also took knockback unlike the Prince, and knocking him back would interrupt his charge, forcing him to run another 2.5 tiles to initiate it again. But he came with 2 significant advantages. One being that he dealt area damage, meaning he could hit multiple units at once. Cards like Skeleton Army were a really tough counter to the Prince because he attacked relatively slowly and could only deal with 1 at a time, whereas Dark Prince could slice through with a few well-angled hits. His radius was 1 tile, so pretty small for a splash card, but it was still useful. One special thing about Dark Prince was that in charging mode, upon collision, this would come out like a 360-degree area attack. Some splash cards you can counter with Fragile Swarms if you surround them just right. But you couldn't really do that with Dark Prince when he was charging because his out-of-charge splash attack was like a Valkyrie. When he wasn't charging though, you could efficiently surround him. This was unique and made it so you had to be very careful when dealing with him. You had to be aware of what he was capable of when he was in his normal versus charging state. That wasn't the only advantage it had though. On top of his normal health, he would have a shield that was about 28% of his normal hit points. What made the shield special was that it had to be broken through before the Dark Prince itself would begin taking damage. So for example, at level 1, a P.E.K.K.A dealt 450 damage whereas the Dark Prince's shield had 200 hit points, but if the P.E.K.K.A hit the Dark Prince once, it would only deal enough to take out the shield and nothing more. Even if the shield only had 1 hit point left, 1 burst of damage could not damage it and the Dark Prince at the same time. It was certainly far better to have 700 hit points with a 200 hit point shield than to have 900 hit points. Other cards would get the shield mechanic later, but at this point, it was exclusive to the Dark Prince. So how was the Dark Prince upon release? Undoubtedly right out of the gate, it was clear that it was one of the best cards in the game. Within 5 days of its release, it rose to having a 29% use rate in top ladder, making it the 10th most used card in the top 100. 29% isn't anything too crazy for the time, but the fact it was not even a week old goes to show how motivated people were to include him. He was seen in a variety of decks, but the one thing that all these decks had in common was that it also contained the Prince. Prince had a massive upsurge in usage following the Dark Prince's release, because these two worked really well together. Prince was a high pressure, high damage dealer, and Dark Prince was a high pressure splasher. Cards that could counter one of them well, the other could deal with better. Together, they were almost unstoppable. Just bring the princess or arrows for any potential minion hordes and you were pretty much set. There wasn't anything great that could efficiently counter both of them. Some of the decks people were playing at the top didn't even really have a win condition. The princes were reliable enough to take down towers on their own. Decks were built around just assisting and supporting the princes. It was pretty easy to play them too. Now, Prince had been out for longer than Dark Prince, and it was one of the easiest cards to obtain since it was a starter epic, and it had garnered a reputation as being a very low-skill, noob, annoying card. It had been statistically balanced competitively, but was terrorizing the lower arenas. A lot of lower players wanted Prince nerfed, but they had been holding off on that because any further nerfs would have potentially made him competitively unviable. But with the Dark Prince, their power was heightened so much that it was statistically overpowered even in competitive play now, so it wouldn't be long at all before Supercell took action. Not even a month after the Dark Prince's addition, he would receive his first balance change, which would be the exact same change the Prince got. Their charging speed would go from 2.3 tiles per second to 2 tiles per second, making it now match the other cards in the very fast speed category. This meant now when chasing something like a Hog Rider, the Dark Prince would never be able to catch up to it until it stopped. Supercell states the win rate for Prince wasn't too absurd, so I assume Dark Prince was about the same, and they wanted to give players more time to react to them since that's what made them so strong. I think this change made the princes feel less epic, but I understand why they did it. It ultimately did not do enough to tone down the Dark Prince though, because following the changes, its use rate was higher than it was at the beginning of the month. It was even higher than the Prince now. The meta had been developing, and it was being realized that Dark Prince was quite stronger than most people initially thought. After the balance changes, there was a trifecta combo that took players by storm. Dark Prince and Prince were still thriving together, but now very often you were seeing P.E.K.K.A. paired with them. This seemed like an unlikely synergy at first glance. Double Princes were already a pretty expensive combo, and now you were throwing in another one of the most expensive cards in the game, and not only expensive, but one of the slowest cards in the game, having triple the deploy time and the slowest movement speed. It seemed absurd, but it was exploding in popularity in April, and this variant in particular was all over the leaderboards. Expensiveness wasn't a huge issue because the Elixir Collector was included, and this card was very helpful in producing the extra Elixir this deck needed. P.E.K.K.A. and Dark Prince worked so well together because the P.E.K.K.A. protected the Dark Prince from high damage units, and the Dark Prince protected the P.E.K.K.A. from swarms. However, one important thing to note about this deck is that it was very anti-free-to-play. This deck had 4 epics and 2 legendaries, and maxing out decks, especially legendaries, would cost literally thousands if not tens of thousands of dollars at the time. So really, only a tiny subsection of the players had to deal with this deck at its fullest potential. Most people couldn't upgrade epics very high or even unlock legendaries, so if you were a casual player around this time, it wasn't as bad as I'm making it seem. Princes were still annoying though, so there were players that wanted nerfs, but that's not exactly what Supercell was going to do. The next set of balance changes would arrive on May 3rd, but P.E.K.K.A., Prince, and Dark Prince were not in this set. It seemed absurd to not tone down any of these meta drivers based on what I said, but there was actually a good reason to exempt them this time. You see, epics and legendaries in general were better at the top level than in tournament play because of the way the leveling system worked, and in this May update, they would be rectifying that by adding an additional level for commons and rares. There was actually a major Helensky tournament in April, and in that tournament, not a single P.E.K.K.A. Double Prince deck was used. In fact, Prince and Dark Prince didn't even make a single appearance. It was ruling top ladder, but not seen as even decent for tournament play. The tournament standard and top ladder environments would be much closer after this new level was added, and since Dark Prince was practically unseen in tournament play, it was smart to see how he settled after the level was applied. A new level adds about 10% health and damage, so every common and rare getting this was basically an indirect nerf to all epics. Epics were just overused because of the pay-to-win leveling system, and with that fixed, we weren't going to be seeing these kinds of anti-free-to-play decks so much anymore. Despite getting no direct nerfs, the environment changed a lot after the May update. Not having that epic bonus was devastating. P.E.K.K.A. Double Prince died very quickly, and Dark Prince's individual usage dropped to an all-time low. With so many commons and rares being more effective against them, there were far less instances of Princes being able to get a clutch last-second charge, which mattered a lot. It was clear that this card needed help, but they seemed to be hesitant. Surprisingly, both P.E.K.K.A. and Prince would receive buffs in June, but Dark Prince was exempt, which was odd to me because they were basically all in the same position, and if you wanted to get technical, Prince and P.E.K.K.A. were actually doing slightly better in top ladder. And I don't have the exact stats for low ladder, but I have to imagine Prince was doing better in that range since you unlocked it earlier. I suppose they could have thought buffing all 3 would have been too much, and that perhaps just buffing Dark Prince's synergizers would bring him back, but that's certainly not how it would play out. Those changes did not make a difference in the Dark Prince's top ladder performance. It's also possible they had been holding off because they had bigger plans for the Dark Prince though, because only a couple of weeks after the P.E.K.K.A. and Prince buffs, on July 4th, Dark Prince would appear in the changes as well, and it would get 2 significant buffs. Firstly, it got a small damage buff just like the Prince got recently, but it was also changed so that it would no longer take knockback, so now it would be consistent with the standard Prince. I never understood why that was inconsistent in the first place. This was huge because this meant fireballs and rockets could no longer reset the Dark Prince's charge. Also, it was good timing because the new Bowler card was released at the same time, who dealt knockback with each attack, so if he was in the meta, Dark Prince would have been significantly worse. I would guess the reason these changes came later than the Prince and P.E.K.K.A. changes was because they needed to wait for a client update to implement the knockback resistance change. Not taking knockback would certainly help, but it was never really countered with knockback dealing cards anyway, and an 8% damage increase wasn't even really enough to make up for the common level boost, especially since its health wasn't compensated. So although you'd see a mini resurgence of P.E.K.K.A. Double Prince following the July buff, Dark Prince wasn't really seeing any competitive play even after this. It was pretty bad, so next month it would appear in the balance changes again. On August 24th, 2016, Dark Prince's damage would be increased by another 8%. These damage buffs were obviously not nothing, but there weren't any significant interaction changes. By the end of September, not even a single top ladder player was using Dark Prince. It was a bit odd because the Prince was still doing just fine, and they had felt about equal before the new May level, but the environment was just not favorable for this card. For the rest of 2016, Dark Prince would get no more buffs. It sat at the bottom, out of the spotlight, not seeing much use in any area of the game. Some believed it was just a bad time for Dark Prince. With meta shifts, it could rise again. But as the months went by, it was clear that this was not going to happen. Dark Prince was a one-deck wonder. It was thriving for a little while, but the cards that had supported it for that brief period were far past their prime, and that environment was not coming back. 2017 was not a great year for this card, although it was looking to be more promising at first. In January, we saw this Golem deck see a little bit of use in top ladder. Dark Prince was still underperforming, but the fact it was seeing any play at all in a top ladder deck was exceptional at this point. On top of that, he would be receiving a balance change in February. They had increased his damage over time to make up for the damage he lost compared to commons and rares, but never his health. So in this set of changes, they would increase his health by 5%. But once again, there weren't any significant interaction changes from this. Most players who commented on it agreed that they didn't really expect this buff to do anything, and ultimately they were right because Dark Prince was still sitting at 0% top ladder usage following the change. It seems like the devs believed that Dark Prince was on the verge of being viable and that it really just needed a nudge. This belief makes sense to some extent because Dark Prince was a top card at one point and it hadn't received any direct nerf since that peak. But it was becoming apparent that this belief wasn't reality. The environment had changed so much and it had only been getting worse over time. With its rock bottom performance persisting, Supercell had no choice but to buff this card yet again. But we would have to wait another 6 months for this. In August 2017, Dark Prince would be changed again, but it was just some more basic stat increases. Its damage would be increased by 6%, and its hit speed would be reduced by 1/10 of a second. One major interaction that changed was now it could take out a musketeer or wizard with a charge in 1 hit instead of 2. 3 musketeers were prominent at the time, so making it able to counter this troop better made sense. Its overall damage per second was increased by about 15%. This was definitely a better buff than the previous ones. Initially, you were seeing it appear occasionally with 3 musketeers as a substitution for battle ram. I can see the appeal since they were both high pressure charging cards and had a shield, but ultimately it was not a solid replacement. At least it wasn't sitting at 0% now though. In the following months, you saw him working his way into P.E.K.K.A and Giant decks, but these decks weren't very popular. That would be until December when 2 favorable Dark Prince developments would occur. Firstly, its shield was buffed so that Inferno beams would reset after taking it out rather than the beam continuing uninterrupted onto the base Dark Prince. So now it would take way more time for the Inferno Dragon and Tower to take it out. Now, interestingly enough, this was actually supposed to be implemented back in October, and in fact, it was. But there was a bug with it where if any troop lost its shield while the Inferno source was locked onto anything, it would reset, regardless of the Inferno's target. As a result, it was reversed in a maintenance break a few days later, but now with the bugs patched, it was finally ready to be implemented permanently. On top of this change, the regular Prince was getting buffed, so you saw a surge of Double Prince with Giant following that. It wasn't near the level P.E.K.K.A Double Prince was at during its peak, but it was decent. Even with the recent Prince and Dark Prince buffs though, Dark Prince's top ladder use rate only peaked at about 7%. But by January it had fallen again as Giant decks were subbing out Dark Prince. However, this time, it seems like it was on the verge of viability unlike before. It may not have had the best stats, but it was actually working pretty well in this Golem Double Prince deck at the top of ladder, and it still finished number 10 in a Giant Double Prince deck for the January season. If given a small buff or even just a little more time, it very well could have been thriving again. And Supercell wanted to nudge him into the meta again, so in February 2018, we would see him in the balance changes again. This time, his health was being increased by another 5%, his hit speed was being decreased by 1/10 of a second, and his first hit attack time was decreased by 1/10 of a second. Again, there were no severe interaction changes, but it had been seeing some competitive play recently before this, so it wouldn't have been smart to change any major interactions. By this point, it had been nearly 2 years since Dark Prince was meta, so I can understand why they were so eager to boost him. And the last few buffs hardly made a difference, so it seemed safe. However, this time, Supercell went too far. Dark Prince was really strong after these buffs. It was seen everywhere in February. By the end of the season, it was used in 70 or 35% of the top 200 decks, making it the 3rd most used troop. You were seeing it in everything from bridge spam to P.E.K.K.A control to 3 musketeers to Golem beatdown. The most popular deck you saw it in by far though was Giant Double Prince. This isn't the first time we've seen Giant Double Prince played in top ladder, but it was certainly at its peak. At the end of the February season, nearly 20% of the top 200 decks alone were Giant Double Prince, which was double the 2nd most popular deck. So arguably, it was on the same level now as P.E.K.K.A Double Prince was in April 2016. The Prince combo felt similar to how it was back in the day. They were very hard to efficiently counter when they were played together. And it's no surprise that it felt this way again. Not only did Dark Prince regain the health and damage he indirectly lost for being an epic, but he hit so much faster now compared to then. These buffs had been slowly adding up, and it had reached the tipping point. The main question now was, how was Supercell going to deal with this new Dark Menace? By the end of March, Dark Prince's top ladder use rate had reached 45% in top ladder, making it the third most used card and second most used troop card overall. It even surpassed the log in usage. And I always say, if a card ever passes the log in usage, it's getting screwed in the balance changes. A nerf was imminent, but it wouldn't be until over 2 months since the last change on April 25th, 2018 for the next set of changes to come. Instead of reverting one of the previous buffs though, they would change a stat that had not been changed up to this point. Shield health. Its shield health was being changed for the first time ever, being decreased by 25%. This made it consistent with the guard's shields. It was certainly a significant downgrade. A lot of troops, including Valkyrie, Mega Minion, and many more would be able to take out the shield in one hit now rather than two, plus the log would be able to take it out now. Even though it doesn't seem like that big of a loss since the shield didn't have that many hit points to begin with, the fact it would take one less hit from so many high damage dealers was going to have a major impact. The shield definitely felt a lot more flimsy after this, but it was still good. Dark Prince had a substantial drop in play, but Giant Double Prince remained the most popular deck, and you still saw Dark Prince in pretty much everything you saw it in before, except Three Musketeers. Although it wasn't as meta-defining and game-breaking as before, it was still very popular and had way more usage than a card should have, which is why it was a bit of a shock when it was exempt from the next set of balance changes. Princes had been dominating the meta for months, and it was getting exhausting for many. Why wouldn't you give it another small nerf? Well, part of the reason could have been because they were trying to indirectly nerf it. Valkyrie was buffed in this set of changes to hopefully make it a more appealing alternative. Although there are some key differences between them, they were both relatively high hit point splashers, so making her better could potentially persuade users to use her instead of Dark Prince. Also, in their explanation, they mentioned that she would be better against the princes specifically, so they did acknowledge that they were a problem. However, this did nothing to quash the Dark Prince's strength. Dark Prince wasn't strong because of a lack of competition, it just provided too much value for its cost. So in the next set of balance changes on June 20th, 2018, Dark Prince would get nerfed once again. And once again, they would be touching a stat that hadn't been changed up to this point. Its charge-up distance was being increased from 2.5 to 3.5 tiles. This was actually part of a consistency overhaul to make every card's charge-up distance the same, and previously this card had the shortest one tied with Prince. This meant now it took an additional second for it to begin charging. This was absolutely a devastating nerf. This card's high tempo is what made it so strong. People recognized very quickly that this was the end of the Prince's era, at least for now. And I think a lot of Dark Prince users were also just generally unsatisfied at this specific change because it was so much more obvious. You might barely notice if a card gets a small health, damage, or hit speed adjustment, but with charge range, you really felt it every time you played it. Both Prince's charge range had always been 2.5 tiles, and that's what felt natural. It felt fine-tuned and perfect the way it was. That extra second you had to wait felt like a drain every time to so many Prince and Dark Prince players. I think even if Dark Prince was statistically balanced after this, players still would have hated the way they went about it because of this. But unfortunately for users, Dark Prince would not be statistically balanced after this. Like I said, this was devastating, and the rates reflected that. You weren't seeing it appear in any top decks anymore, and its use and win rates were far below average. Nothing really changed for the rest of 2018. Dark Prince remained in about 2 to 3% of Grand Challenge decks with a win rate around the mid to low 40s, indicating that it was weak and needed a buff. But it would not get any more balance changes for the rest of the year. It's understandable to an extent why. What seemed like such a small buff to a weak card back in February flipped the card from being below average to top 3 overnight, so they needed to be more careful. As time passed, Dark Prince's rates got lower and lower. As the Prince was shining in the spotlight, the Dark Prince laid in the shadows. Something was going to need to happen for this card to see some competitive viability. By 2019, it had fallen to be played in just 1% of Grand Challenge decks with a win rate in the 30s. Balance changes would come every month, yet Dark Prince would be absent time and time again. It wouldn't be until May 6th, 2019, almost a year since its devastating nerf, for him to appear in the balance changes once again, which would change 2 of his stats that had never been changed before. Firstly, his splash radius was increased by 1/4 of a tile, and his range was increased by 2/10 of a tile, so now both would be 1 1/4 tiles. Dark Prince had always felt kind of awkward when dealing with swarms. It often felt like he was missing troops that he should have hit. This change would make him feel more consistent and just an overall better counter to swarms, which is what he should have been all along. However, within just days of this buff, it was clear that Supercell had gone too far once again, because by May 10th, he had become the most used troop card in Grand Challenges, appearing in nearly 1/3 of all decks with the highest win rate. They just could not find a solid middle ground for this guy. He was either S tier or bottom tier, no in between. Not only were you seeing him a lot in P.E.K.K.A, Golem, and Giant Double Prince again, but some Graveyard and Logbait players were shoving him in there too. And even a Royal Giant Double Prince deck started trending for a bit in June. Him being able to cover a bigger area meant there'd be situations where he'd clear a defense one hit quicker than before, allowing him enough time to get one final charge onto something significant. Plus, with that range increase, he could connect to his target 1/10 of a second faster than before while charging. It doesn't sound like a lot, but you gotta remember 1/10 of a second is a lot of time when a card is moving that fast. These were major interaction differences that easily explain why this card was so popular all of a sudden. I wouldn't say Dark Prince was at its all-time peak of strength, but it was up there. Once again, we had a period where your opponent playing Dark Prince every third battle was the reality. The search for a middle ground would continue. The next change it got would come about 2 months later on July 1st. This time, instead of randomly changing some other stat, they would partially revert the previous buffs. His range would be decreased by 5/100ths of a tile, and for consistency, his splash radius was also decreased by 5/100ths of a tile. This wasn't really meant to bring Dark Prince down, but rather it was part of an overhaul to make melee ranges more consistent. To bring Dark Prince into the new melee medium category, it had to be slightly adjusted. Even though it was fairly small and wasn't meant to be a direct nerf, there would be some situations where you could clearly see the difference. It probably would have been justified to go a bit harder, but given the unstable nature of this card, I can see why they didn't want to push any further nerfs at this time. Looking at its performance following the change, you can see it had actually gone down substantially from what it was at when the change first went live. It was still performing too well, but the nerf had certainly made a difference. Supercell would decide to let the card settle for a bit, as although Dark Prince was strong, it wasn't disrupting the game immensely like at previous peaks. I think at certain points they had been a bit fast to change this card in the past, so I like that they were being a bit more cautious now. But unfortunately, leaving this card alone was going to have some repercussions. You see, in August 2019, the P.E.K.K.A's range was doubled, making it very prominent. Suddenly, you were seeing it everywhere, meaning Dark Prince, as a decent support unit, had a spike in usage as well. Almost every popular P.E.K.K.A deck also had a Dark Prince in it, but it wasn't only appearing in that. You were seeing this Goblin Giant Sparky deck begin to trend in August as well, and Dark Prince also played a huge part in this deck. Overall, you were seeing it in about 1/4 of Grand Challenge decks for the August season, making it the third most popular troop card. High-tempo P.E.K.K.A decks were at an all-time height of strength. Even though P.E.K.K.A was the main driver of the sudden surge of Dark Prince usage, Dark Prince was still technically outperforming it. It makes sense given this card was already doing extremely well before the P.E.K.K.A rework, but it meant that it was not going to be safe from the nerf hammer. The next set of balance changes would arrive on September 2nd, and Dark Prince would finally get some much needed attention. In this set, his splash radius would be decreased by 1/10 of a tile. His range would remain the same, as that was standardized. Combine that with the P.E.K.K.A nerf, and you get a pretty hefty drop in Dark Prince usage. His use rate wasn't too high, and his win rate was closer to 50%. Still a little strong statistically, but a huge improvement from where he's been for most of his life. There wasn't really a huge shift in what decks you saw him in. P.E.K.K.A and Goblin Giant were still often including it. P.E.K.K.A was just less popular given the nerf. The next few months were going to be a little bumpy though. We would see a huge meta shift in October with the addition of the Elixir Golem and some overbuffs to multiple other cards. Heavy high-tempo decks were not good in this environment. There was a demand for splashers, but other cards filled that role better. Valkyrie had taken over as the dominant 4 Elixir splash unit, and Dark Prince's rates fell like a rock. Elixir Golem and Witch were the meta drivers, and that card was just way better at dealing with that combo. The environment had shifted so much overnight, and Dark Prince wasn't able to adapt unlike before. Luckily, this was just a product of a temporary radical environment. By December, when things were returning closer to normal, you saw Dark Prince's rates return up to a healthy range. We had never seen Dark Prince be in this average of a position before. It finally seemed like Supercell nailed the balance. 2020 would go on to be a very tame year for the Dark Prince. His use rate continued to hover around 7 to 10%, with his win rate remaining at 45 to 55%, which is exactly the range for a healthy card. The main deck he was seen in was still Giant Double Prince. This version with the Miner was very popular throughout 2020. The other decks he was seen in would often sub him out depending on the environment and playstyle of the user. For example, in P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam, he would very often be subbed out for the Royal Ghost. Or in June, when 3 Musketeers were popular, a lot of users switched him out in this popular deck for Skeletons. And in this Golem deck, you saw Dark Prince interchanged with Night Witch and Goblin Cage. He would make plenty of guest appearances in a variety of meta decks, but he was almost never necessary. He was easily replaceable. It was a really weird position to be in because it was still performing decently for the most part of the year. However, even though Dark Prince would not receive any direct balance changes in 2020, there was one standardization rule created that pretty much only harmed Dark Prince, even though it wasn't meant to. Basically, in June, almost every card with multiple units was given a staggered deploy, meaning they wouldn't drop in the arena at the same time like they used to. Usually when you placed a swarm on a Dark Prince, its 360-degree splash would hit everything, cleaning it up nicely if it could get one shot by it. But now, since each unit would load in one at a time, that charge would only ever hit a single troop if that swarm was placed right on top of it, effectively making his splash pointless. Remember, his attack came out instantly when he was charging, so he wouldn't be able to hit more than one unit because it took an additional 1/10 of a second for each additional unit to spawn in. Luckily, although it would certainly hurt in some scenarios, it didn't seem to affect Dark Prince too badly. We would see a small spike at the end of the year following the release and rise of the Electro Giant, as Dark Prince became a staple in its most popular deck, which were very similar to the Golem ones he was used in previously. Electro Giant worked better than Golem at this point in time, which was very beneficial to the Dark Prince. By the end of 2020, his rates were still not too outrageous, but he was above average, teetering on the edge of being an average versus generally powerful card. It wasn't just the Electro Giant surge causing Dark Prince to thrive though. Fisherman was nerfed in December, and that had been keeping Golem down. With it being slightly worse, you were seeing it make a comeback, which brought Dark Prince along. But the developments wouldn't stop there. Unlike 2020, 21 would be a crazy year for Dark Prince, with lots of major development. Around the end of January, beginning of February, we were seeing a new double Prince deck begin to trend. Not with P.E.K.K.A., not with Giant, not with Royal Giant, but with Graveyard. There was definitely a shock factor when it came to the strength of this deck. Zappies and Hunter were also just very strong defensive cards at the time, which helped a lot. This was such a different style from P.E.K.K.A. or Giant Double Prince, yet it was still able to work really well. It really went to show the power of the Double Prince combo. That would be until Hunter and Zappies received major nerfs in the March balance changes. Even though Graveyard Double Prince would phase out of the meta though, Dark Prince was still doing just fine. In fact, its use rate increased following that set of changes. Giant Double Prince and Electro Giant with Dark Prince were thriving, keeping it alive and well. And towards the end of May, we would see this new variant of P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam gain some traction. Going into June, this Electro Giant deck was the most popular deck in the game, and with prominent use in P.E.K.K.A. and Giant Double Prince as well, Dark Prince had borderline nerf deserving rates. But thankfully, it did not receive one because things were about to get really crazy. On June 12, 2021, the Goblin Joe would be released, which completely warped the meta. Once again, we had an environment where demand for ground splash units were high. And although Valkyrie had a surge in usage as it's almost always a go-to in these ground swarm metas, Dark Prince had a bigger surge. It was arguably the best counter to Goblin Drill as it could prevent all damage. But the one thing that made it so much more appealing in this environment versus the Elixir Golem Witch meta was its knockback immunity. You see, Goblin Drill would push back units upon entry, so if you placed a Valkyrie too early, the drill could push it out of the optimal place. This wasn't a problem for Dark Prince, obviously. Plus, since the Dark Prince moved very fast and the Goblin Drill deployed very slow, you could place the Dark Prince in the back when you knew your opponent was about to use the drill, and it could begin charging and would run right into the drill wherever it popped up. You were seeing Dark Prince everywhere once again. Not just in P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam, Giant Double Prince, and Electro Giant, but also in this Goblin Drill control deck as well as Royal Giant and Golem. By the end of the month, it had risen to become the most used troop in Grand Challenges, with a 33% use rate and an astonishing 57% win rate, significantly higher than even the drill itself. Normally these would be emergency nerf deserving rates, but this was obviously the product of a chaotic environment, so there was no need for immediate action. There weren't a lot of balance changes in 2021 though, so things would remain stagnant for a few months. The next set of balance changes came in September, and the Goblin Joe was nerfed, and following that change, the Dark Prince's rates fell to about what they were at the start of June before the drill's addition, practically only seen in the few decks it had been seen in for ages now. A Dark Prince nerf honestly probably could have been justified all year now, but it wasn't really complained about and it never really caused a major disruption in the meta, and given its delicacy when balancing in the past, I would say it was the right move to leave it alone. Unfortunately, even with a solid year throughout, 2021 would end off not so well. This Electro Giant deck that had consistently been so popular would fall out of the meta after a major Goblin Cage nerf in December. And you weren't really seeing a lot of P.E.K.K.A. with Dark Prince anymore because the Battle Ram was buffed, making it a more appealing option with those decks. Dark Prince still certainly had a place, but it was diminishing. Strangely though, just 2 months into 2022, he would appear in the balance changes yet again for the first time in over 2 years. But it wasn't going to be a straight buff or nerf, rather a rework. It seems like a weird time to be giving this card a rework considering it already had a place and its rates weren't too good or bad. But Prince was getting the same rework, and I think if the Prince was getting it, it wouldn't have made sense for the Dark Prince to not get it. But the Prince's rates were also healthy, so I really don't understand what this was for. The rework was going to be a health decrease of 3%, but now he would have the ability to jump over the river. I don't think anybody saw this change coming. In their explanation, they say, hogs can jump, rams can jump, why not the ponies? I don't think anybody was really asking this question though, because the answer seems obvious. The princes are wearing heavy suits of armor and carry big weapons, whereas the troops riding the hog and ram are much lighter. The ponies are weighed down, so being able to jump should be more difficult for them. The community was caught off guard by this rework for sure, and opinions seem to be mixed on how good for the game this would be. One reason Supercell could have opted to balance it this way is because back in 2020 to 2021, we saw Dark Prince being subbed out a lot in its most popular decks, so they wanted to make it a bit more unique. Since Dark Prince seems to be kind of phasing out, they decided to go with it because a straight buff would have probably made it too strong and not fixed that core issue. That doesn't really seem to make sense since Dark Prince was seen in a wide variety of decks throughout most of 2021, but I can't think of a better reason. I think honestly, they probably just did it to shake things up. This change would definitely help princes stand out a bit more. Now they were the only ground troop targeting troops to be able to jump over the river, meaning they could get to center place troops or buildings very quickly without having to deal with the disadvantages air units have for being air units. Royal Ghost and Battle Healer could technically already cross over the river with their hover ability, but they were slower and just not as effective in most circumstances. Dark Prince would especially be better against Inferno Towers now thanks to its shield. But really against any defensive building or spawner defense, you could place a Dark Prince in the center if you had a tank crossing the bridge and the Dark Prince could get to it quicker, clearing the path. It was an interesting approach for sure, but would it help? Well, the fallout of this rework would lead to some interesting development. Initially, it didn't seem to make any difference. The health decrease was small, and being able to jump over the river really only helped in certain scenarios. The main thing to note is the Prince's rates were slipping. The rework seems to harm him more than the Dark Prince, and the only reason I need to bring this up in this video is because the only top deck you were seeing Dark Prince in consistently was Giant Double Prince. So having 1/3 of the heart of the deck not being able to perform as well was going to cause some issues. Both cards lost precious hit points, and you honestly didn't really need two cards that could move fast and jump the river. So in February 2022, this deck that had consistently been in the top deck list since 2020 finally fell off. Prince was no longer viable, therefore the deck could not work, and therefore went the Dark Prince's best deck. The Double Prince combo had been a staple in Clash Royale since the Dark Prince's addition. There were certainly some struggles after level 13 was added in 2016, but the combo pushed out, got buffs, and found light in lots of other decks together. But for the foreseeable future at least, Dark Prince would have to tread on alone. So if Dark Prince was still performing well and Prince was out of the meta, what decks were Dark Prince thriving in? Well, it was still seen with Giant sometimes, like in this Giant Graveyard deck. It was also beginning to replace the Royal Ghost and Bridge spam more often again because they were more similar now since they could both cross over the river. Clearly this card still had a lot of potential, but overall its performance remained consistent. The rates were still about as average as you could hope for, which I guess means the rework was successful, at least for the Dark Prince. That's the last major development we'd see for a while though. Although Dark Prince was solid, he wasn't really seen in any of the top decks after March. He was used occasionally in a few different archetypes, but there wasn't one variant of anything that really thrived with him. Even when the Electro Giant had a resurgence in the summer of 2022, the most popular variants were not including Dark Prince. We wouldn't really see this card claim a spot in the most popular deck list again until November of that year. This would be thanks to the new Phoenix card. This deck had actually been around for a little while already, just replacing the Skeleton Dragons with Phoenix, but this version was significantly more popular. Thanks to this new card's support, Dark Prince was able to shine, and despite the Phoenix being nerfed in December, it continued to see prominent use. By the end of 2022, Dark Prince still had an average use rate, but it had a very decent win rate. We would see another significant development in January 2023, however, that being the resurgence of Giant Double Prince. Thanks to a Prince buff in late 2022 and the new powerful Phoenix taking over for the floundering Mega Minion, it was able to work again for now. For the first half of 2023, you basically saw Dark Prince in these two decks, but this was not a steady environment. Giant Double Prince would phase out again in April, and this Golem deck that had been steady in the meta for over 6 months would evolve to no longer include Dark Prince in June after Battle Healer, Skeleton Dragon, and Night Witch buffs, plus another Phoenix nerf. The second half of the year wasn't too interesting. With evolutions reshaping the meta, Dark Prince was floating around, appearing in some beatdown decks, but not ones that would stay in the meta for long. Things would only get worse in 2024. As more evolutions were flooding the arena, Dark Prince's rates were trickling down. There were a few popular decks here and there that included it, but none of these would save it from its dwindling relevance. The meta was changing constantly at this point, and it was going to get worse before it got better. By June, it had just a 1% use rate with a win rate in the low 30s, meaning it was competitively unviable. It seemed just about time for another buff, but it would not be getting one anytime soon. You could argue it was fair, since it was seen in a few meta decks just a few months ago, so not enough time had passed to know if Dark Prince would really settle here, if it weren't for the fact that the Prince would be getting a huge charge range decrease. That's right, in June, Prince's charge range would be reduced all the way to 1.5 tiles, and even the Ram Rider got the same change, so they would both match the evolved Royal Recruits. What I don't understand is why Prince would get this change and not Dark Prince. In the past, Prince and Dark Prince were so in sync when it came to receiving balance changes. In 2016, they got their charge speed reduced at the same time, and they got similar damage buffs around the same time. They got their charge ranges standardized together in 2018, and they both got their ability to jump the river in February 2022. It wasn't even a matter of one performing way better over the other. Prince had been in about the same position as Dark Prince. It was appearing occasionally in meta decks over the last few months, but had fallen off recently. Also to note, every other charging card's charge range had been decreased to 3 tiles by now. Dark Prince was the only charging card to maintain the old standardized charging range of 3.5 tiles. I understand not changing it when the Prince got his charge range reduced in 2022 because Dark Prince was objectively doing better, but at this point it needed the help. Maybe they didn't need to reduce it to the Prince's new level, but even reducing it to 2.5 or 3 tiles would not have been ridiculous. It was so weird and inconsistent that the Prince charged in less than half the time it took for the Dark Prince to charge now. It just felt like an eternity. So now, while all these other charging cards were thriving in the spotlight and seeing use in lots of new decks, Dark Prince laid at the bottom, in the shadows, left behind, unable to keep up with his charging friends. The second half of 2024 would be a bit more interesting. Even though Dark Prince would continue to receive no buffs, there would be some notable development. June was actually the lowest low of the year, as even in July we would begin to see a mini comeback. There's a few different things we can attribute to this. Firstly, Prince and Ram Rider would get slight walkbacks of their charge range decreases, so the differences between them and Dark Prince wasn't as staggering. And we would see the addition of the Goblin Drill evolution. Unlike the base version, the evolved version would pop up 3 times, so it was more difficult to efficiently counter. The Dark Prince remained one of the, if not the best counter to it. That knockback resistance came in extra handy this time around, so some people were definitely using it to help with that. Although it may have been seen here and there though, it wasn't really appearing in any meta decks, and was ultimately still below average in terms of use and win rate. One deck it was performing sort of well in though was this giant graveyard deck. You saw Dark Prince in a few graveyard decks that finished at the top, and this was the most popular one, and it even finished 8th in the world for the July 2024 season. It wouldn't be until August until we would see a huge spike. Double Prince was back once again. This deck, utilizing the evolved Goblin Giant, was trending in August, proving that the Double Prince synergy was still alive. This deck was trending for months, and I'd say it was on the same level as Giant Double Prince or even the OG P.E.K.K.A. Double Prince. Clearing lanes was so easy with this deck because it had so many spells and the princes to clean up. Escorting the Goblin Giant to the tower was the goal because it could summon more units the longer it stayed alive. This deck was so good that even in a special game mode where you could use 8 evolutions, this was one of the, if not the best deck in that challenge despite it only containing 3 cards with an evolution. Just when it seemed like Dark Prince was in the clear, however, some new events would lead the card to spiral out of the meta just as quickly as it entered it. Firstly, Evolved Zap and Bomber were nerfed, which had been key players in this deck. And the Evolved Goblin Drill was nerfed to no longer knock back on its second and third entries, so way more cards could counter it better now. Goblinstein was also released, and it warped the meta. You didn't see a lot of beatdown decks because of it, which hurt the Dark Prince a lot, since that's what it was primarily being seen in at this point. P.E.K.K.A. was very popular, but those users were just using Ram Rider, as it was just an all-around better pressure option, and it just synergized better with Goblinstein, who was way better at clearing paths than Dark Prince could even hope to. Thanks to these developments, Dark Prince's rates plummeted once again to a far below healthy range, and that's pretty much where it would stay for the rest of the year. In October, only 1 Dark Prince finished in the top 100, in November there were none, and in December there were only 2. It was an extremely niche card that could work, but there was practically no reason to not use one of the better alternatives. Its performance was horrendous, and it was looking like it was going to be a continued struggle. But alas, in January 2025, Supercell would come out with one final change. The first change in almost 3 years. It hadn't been changed since that rework where it was changed to Jump the River. Supercell had finally remembered this card's existence, and they were giving it a change that was long overdue. A charge range decrease from 3.5 to 3 tiles, making it the final card to be destandardized from that set of balance changes in June 2018. Nearly 7 years later, it was time for a new standardization according to Supercell. They say in their explanation that they were standardizing charge ranges, so troops that were 4 elixir would have a 3-tile charge range, whereas 5 or more troops would have a 2-tile charge range. So basically, Dark Prince would have the same charge range as the Battle Ram, but still be quite a bit slower than Prince and Ram Rider. So 2025 was off to an excellent start for the card. After over a year of just occasionally popping in and out of the meta with average to subpar rates, this buff would help it maintain some consistent relevancy. Since this buff, we've seen Dark Prince at about 5 to 6% of Grand Challenge decks with a win rate hovering around 55%, which are solid stats. The buff seems to be on point. As for the decks you've been seeing him in recently, it's nothing new. He's still been primarily seen in Giant Double Prince and also with the evolved Goblin Giant. I think he's in a great place today, but we'll just have to see if that holds. He has still yet to receive an evolution, so time will only tell what effect that will have on his future journey. One evolution idea I would love is if they made it so the longer it charges, the faster it moves, and the more damage it deals upon collision. Or they could give him like a third stage of charge, so after he charges for 3 tiles, he moves into a super charge. I think it was cool how he could move faster than very fast troops back in the day, so seeing something like that return in an evolution would be great. Let me know if you like that idea and whether or not you think Dark Prince is in a good spot today. Also let me know which card's history you want me to cover next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.